about that time. Okay. Let me see what time it is. Hello, Tani. If you have any landlord tenant questions or any questions regarding landlord immigration or landlord family law immigration or landlord tenant, feel free to type it up and I will answer it since I have a little bit of time. About a minute before we get going. Make sure. Oh, the time is 7 p.m. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Attorney Judith DeLuce Montgomery, and I am coming to you guys today for a discussion about landlord-tenant, especially in the current climate that we're in, dealing with a lot of folks who rent, and landlords trying to figure out what to do, but also the not only residential but commercial. And so what I did a few weeks back when things started to really ramp up, I put together a ebook that can be found on my website at atlfamilyimmigrationlaw.com. It talks about COVID-19, what landlords and tenants need to consider. And so in the midst of a pandemic, let's remember we're all in this together. And so what I put together really was some key points in terms of what both landlords and tenants should be considering going forward. And specifically, I will be speaking about Georgia law because I practice in the state of Georgia. Landlord tenant is pretty uniform across the board. It just depends on what state you're in and whether it is a landlord leaning state or a tenant leaning state. Georgia happens to be a state that is landlord leaning, and so it's important for tenants to understand where they are and where they stand in the current climate. And so a couple of things, I put a list together, and again, you can download this ebook for free at no cost on my website, but it just gave a list of things to consider. And one of the first points that I made is to review your lease, because payment obligations will usually or generally rest on the specific language that is in the lease, but it is not clear. And so you don't want either party to assume one or the other. I did give an opportunity for folks to submit questions, and so I will be answering those questions. I did receive them. I thank you for submitting them. So I will be answering those questions as we go on today. Hey, Peggy, thanks for joining on Instagram. I am live both on Facebook and also Instagram. So thanks guys for joining. So some of the points to look at when you are considering the lease, that there are many factors to consider, especially in these uncertain times. And so the courts are not necessarily looking at the four corners of the document. Usually they would be, and not to say that that's not what's going to happen, but what is going on is so unprecedented that courts are literally trying to keep up. And so what we're seeing is that mayors, specifically, I can give an example that the Atlanta mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, she has done a moratorium of evictions for 60 days. And so that means that landlords are not to be filing evictions because people cannot pay their rent. The hope is that landlords and tenants are going to come together and try to work something out. And so as an attorney that has been practicing landlord tenant for several years in the metro Atlanta area, I gave a few things to consider, both parties, for both landlords and tenants. And so the question then becomes, does rent have to be paid in the midst of building closure outside the control of the tenant? So this question lends its hands more towards a commercial lease agreement, right? And so the question is, the building has closed down. That is what the landlord has done in the midst of COVID-19, in terms of maybe preservation, maybe to remove themselves for any possibility of liability, because folks are coming into the building and may then contract COVID-19 and then come after them. And so the question then becomes, what happens? Does rent have to be paid? That's an answer that is not going to be found in a lease agreement, quite frankly. This is something, again, that's unprecedented. And so the landlord has to convey to the tenant their reason for the closure and then what their expectations will be. What we believe is the best thing to do, is to get together and see because obviously if the building is closed, the tenant cannot run their business, right? And if they cannot run their business, they cannot generate income. If you can't generate income, then you can't pay rent. It's as simple as that. And so in the midst of that, what is the landlord going to do? Well, the landlord has some options, because obviously they may have a mortgage themselves that they need to pay. So they should be reaching out to their mortgage company and seeing if they can work out some sort of agreement, in terms of getting a deferment on their mortgage, and then in turn informing the tenant that in the midst of this, you're not required to pay rent. However, it doesn't mean that rent is not due. What we can consider doing is possibly extending the lease, very similar to a mortgage modification, where they are adding the months that the tenant doesn't pay to the back of the loan. I just want to make you guys aware, I will have co-counsel join me throughout this session, and she's about 10 pounds and she growls and she thinks that she is a pit bull. So just so that you guys are aware, she will come in from time to time. So anyways, what the landlord can consider doing is extending the lease, possibly. So if there's 10 months left in a 12-month lease, what they can do is tack on another 2 months and allow the tenant a 60-day opportunity to kind of catch their breath, figure out what they're going to do. Obviously, the government has provided through SBA multiple options to keep businesses afloat. And so hopefully they are applying for that as business owners and trying to come up with that money to pay the rent. But that is an option that can be considered. Can they do an abatement of rent, possibly, in terms of saying, maybe can you pay this portion of your rent this month, and then we can work out a payment plan for the coming months so that we can get you caught back up as things begin to pick up again. That's an option that can be considered. Can the landlord shut down an entire building to comply with shelter-at-home orders? If the tenant is an essential business and continues to provide services, obviously that's a very good question. If you are an essential business, then can the building be shut down? A tenant could argue that no, I should be able to continue to run my business because it's an essential business, as I also plan to continue to pay you rent. And so that's an option to discuss as well for retailers who have been forced to close their businesses. If they breach the lease because of business interruption, what protection does the landlord have? The landlord continues to have the same protection that they've always had, and that is to file an eviction, go to the courts, seek redress. They do have that option. They may not be able to file an eviction this month or next month, but in June, they can say, listen, I haven't been paid rent in 3 months, and I need the property, or I need them to vacate, or I need them to come up with a payment plan on how they're going to address the back rent. So the thing about the state of Georgia is that the covenant to pay rent and the landlord's obligation to keep offices open, it may be separate and distinct, because it has always been the policy, or the statute in the state of Georgia states that the tenant has to continue to pay rent, whether the property becomes uninhabitable, whether there is damage to the property, whether the tenant needs repairs done in the property, rent still has to be paid. So it may be that the covenant to pay rent is still a requirement, right? So that's some things that the landlord can consider as they are looking at their lease agreement and as they are looking at tenants saying, I cannot pay this rent. On the flip side of that, tenants can also consider that, will I be required to pay rent even if I don't have the money to pay rent? Let's say I have now been laid off. What I suggested is that if you have been laid off or has been a reduction in your hours, that you immediately notify the landlord of this, right? So you notify the landlord, you provide them with documentation showing them that it is not a willful intent on your part not to pay rent. It is the circumstances that have led to that. And what are some options that you will have to move forward? And so, listen, everyone is in a bad situation. The tenant is in a bad situation, but also the landlord is in a bad situation. And so, at this point in time, folks really have to be mindful and have some sort of empathy for what's going on, because this is so unprecedented and nobody was prepared for this, including our government, apparently. And so you really can't say, well, if you don't have the money, then I'm going to put you out. Well, where are they going to go? Where is that tenant going to go? And so the hope is that help is coming through the stimulus check that's coming. Obviously, we understand that that isn't going to take you very far. However, we also know that most employers who have had to release folks due to lack of business have or are approving unemployment. We understand that unemployment is, in addition to whatever the state would give you, I believe the federal government is tacking on an additional $600 a week. Only at, I think it's limited to 8 weeks, but that gives you something to consider as well. So a little bit more money would still be coming in the door in addition to the regular unemployment that you would receive. And so it may put you in a position to be able to pay something. And I think that that may be the route to go, would be to look at what can I pay? I can't pay it all, but what can I pay? Maybe you should look at that. And that's when I said maybe the landlord would grant you some sort of abatement if you could provide to them documentation that you will be receiving unemployment or you are receiving unemployment, and for how much. And maybe that may be a consideration that the landlord can make in terms of abating your rent. Now, the other option, and this goes back to commercial leases, this pandemic is outside of my control. Will my commercial liability insurance step in? That's a good question. And so you really now have to review that commercial liability insurance and to determine if that is an option for you, because we don't know. Now, this is not an area that I would address. Obviously, I would refer you out to an attorney who handles insurance claims and can review the provisions and advise you properly. Another thing to consider as a tenant is am I still able to enter the building, run my business, even though the landlord has closed the building? That's obviously a concern and a question that you're going to have to address with that landlord. Now, the question then becomes, has the landlord breached the contract and breached the duty of quiet enjoyment by closing the building and the ability to make money, but still requiring the business to pay rent? As a tenant, you may have an argument. Let's say an eviction is filed at some point in time. Then yes, you may have a solid argument that because the building was shut down, you were not able to conduct your business as usual, and therefore you were not able to pay rent. And there's good reason for that. So you do have some arguments on both sides. On both sides, you have some arguments. And so the question is, let's talk about some protections, right? So landlords have what we believe is some protection in terms of reviewing their loan documents, seeing if they can obtain that deferment from their mortgage company, for how long they can obtain that deferment with a mortgage company. And then be prepared to seek your own abatement from your lenders as a landlord, right? Because COVID-19 is affecting every single business. There is not a person, there is not a business that has not been affected or will not be affected in some way. And so we understand that there is, obviously a massive, 2 trillion emergency spending bill that is promising to assist both individuals and businesses and industries. So this is your opportunity as a landlord to try and assess and reassess whether this is a good time to really be filing an eviction on your tenants, right? And so also looking into seeing, listen, obviously you have liability insurance, you have some protections. So this is your time to really comb and dig into your insurance policies and see if you can also assess a claim there. So there are some protections that landlords can seek because we anticipate that tenants will not be able to pay their rents at very, very astounding amounts. They will not be able to pay their rent. It's just as clear cut as that. And so the next thing that both parties should consider is to preserve your rights. That means that all communications going forward as it relates to any discussion of evictions, be sure to document those things. So please do not, this is something that I tell my clients, whether we're in a pandemic or not, everything, all communication should be in writing, in some form of writing, whether it be a text message, an email, or written correspondence. But verbal communication will not hold up in a court of law. Always be sure to have everything that you discuss or consider or negotiate in writing, okay? Essentially, you want to have that evidence ready for a judge or a mediator. Although the ultimate desire would be to try to resolve the issues without having to come to court at all, because you can imagine that the courts are going to be inundated with these types of cases. And so the judiciary has not spoken. And the reason they haven't spoken is because they have to work within the confines of the law. And so they haven't said anything, but we do believe that in the midst of this pandemic that they are going to be making some adjustments in the way that they would naturally rule on an eviction. We anticipate that we're going to see a shift. We do believe that we will see a shift. And so a clear-cut eviction case may not be what it used to be before, right? And then ultimately, again, as I've discussed, the goal is really to try to mitigate the impact to either party, to find an amicable resolution for both parties, right? Because do you really want to be losing tenants left and right when things do turn around? Absolutely not. Do you want those vacancies? Absolutely not. But a shelter in place is a shelter in place. But I have to remind tenants that if you are sheltering in place, that means you are sheltering in your home. That means you are using your property or that home or that apartment more than ever. And if you are, then understand that that property has value, probably has more value than it's ever had before, which means that yes, rent is due and rent should be paid if you are able to pay it. This is not a time to stop paying rent if you have the funds to pay rent, okay? This is strictly for folks who are not in a position to pay the rent and are doing everything within their power to remain in their home, for them and their families, to remain safe during this pandemic. And so if you can pay something, pay something. But it's important that you reach out to your landlord as soon as possible if you have been laid off or fired from your job. If the industry has shut down, provide them with documentation of the separation. Immediately apply for unemployment as quickly as possible. Provide them with that documentation to show them how much you will be getting, and to see if you can work out some sort of payment arrangement during the months you are not able to pay full rent. Okay? And so obviously we are continuing to monitor the situation at my law firm. And so the goal is that as more information comes in, we will be continuing to advise the public as much as possible and provide them with as much information as possible so that they can make a fair decision as we go on. So, like I said, please log in to the website, which is atlfamilyimmigrationlaw.com, and you can visit the landlord tenant section on that page, and you can download my ebook. And obviously, if you have questions and you would like a confidential consultation, you can always do that by calling us at 678-601-5580 or DMing us. There's always someone that is able to respond or answer a call if you should have one. And so I want to now respond to some of the questions that I had received in my inbox. One of the questions that we received, and I apologize, let me pull that up. I may have to adjust a little bit so that I can see everything here. Let me see, where is my inbox? You guys know I don't know how to work this thing, but I'm gonna try. Here we go. Oh no, I don't want to leave this page. Okay, 1 second. Here we go. Now, so it appears that this person is here with their family. They're living in a home. It looks like they have been laid off, and they're trying to figure out what to do because the landlord is saying that they need to pay their rent. The good thing about the state of Georgia landlord tenant law is that landlords cannot self-evict, which means they cannot change the locks, put you out until they have filed an eviction with the magistrate court. Magistrate court has exclusive jurisdiction over all landlord-tenant matters, which works for you. And so depending on what county, the individual did not provide me with the county that they live in, but depending on the county that you live in, especially if you live in Fulton County, then you're really in a good position because there's a moratorium on evictions right now, at least 60 days. But if that is not the case and the landlord does file the eviction, you do have the opportunity to go to court and obviously present your case. Now, we have not seen any judges that are putting folks out in the midst of the pandemic. So, magistrate court, from my understanding, we do not believe that they are handling any cases at this time in any of the Atlanta metro areas because the courts are on a limited staff. They are closed to the public, and they are only handling essential cases. And essential more so means domestic violence cases, criminal cases. However, landlord-tenant cases obviously are not being heard at this time because the courts are closed to the public. And so that puts you in a position that you will not have a court hearing until several weeks from now. Our understanding is that the courts are not scheduled to reopen until, I believe, until May 13th is the new date that we received, that the courts will be open to the public. And so if that is the case, then luckily for you, you and your family will not be thrown out. You will be able to remain in the property until courts open. And hopefully by that time, you've been able to work something out with the landlord. But heed my advice on what I provided in the ebook, where I talked about options that you would have in terms of trying to work something out with your landlord in the midst of what is going on. So please take that advice to heart. And so I hope that that was helpful for you. If it wasn't, you are free to give me a call. Again, at 678-601-5580, and you will be scheduled for a consultation. The next question that I had was, can I break my lease if there are rats inside the home? I've discovered that I had rats in my so-called new apartment. I moved in a few weeks ago. It sounds like it lives in the attic. and I want to know if I can break my lease. And it does not look like the landlord is trying to resolve the issue. Okay, so great question. If obviously there is an issue of failure to repair here, it's not an issue of inability to pay rent. And so if you just moved into an apartment 5 weeks ago, more than likely you're in some sort of lease agreement. And so it's going to be very hard for you to break that lease without good cause. And so you may find yourself on the hook. Now, what you can do is put in writing that there is a rat infestation in the home, and that the landlord give the landlord an opportunity to come out and cure the issue within the property. Give them a reasonable opportunity to address it. If they do not address it, then you have the option as a tenant to file a lawsuit against the landlord in magistrate court. And so you can bring that case before the courts and sue your landlord and possibly get money for it. It happens quite often. And also, the courts will force the landlord to make those necessary repairs to the property. So you do have the option to do that. I want to check in because I haven't been checking in. Let me see if there are any questions. Okay. Thank you guys. I think one of our new judges in Gwinnett. Hi, Jamie. Jamie, how are you doing? Gwinnett is not doing evictions or dispositions right now, and that's what I thought. No dispossessory warrants are being issued, and no evictions. And courts, as of right now, are scheduled to open on May 13th. So that's good to know. Let me see if there's anything else. So let me see. Clayton County. I think this person is saying, Amelia is saying Clayton County as well. So that's good to know. So like I stated, I do not believe that counties are addressing any evictions or dispossessory evictions at this time. So that puts folks in really a good position. What else? What was another question that came about? Hold on. Okay, this is from a landlord, and it is saying the resident is still living in the deceased father's home. Can I turn off the utilities? Okay, so the answer to that, so dad was hospitalized, dad passed away, family is still living in the home, and so they want to put them out. As a landlord, as I stated earlier, there cannot be any self-help tactics that are taken by the landlord. The landlord must go through the courts to do so. And so in order to put anybody out of a home, you or a business, you will have to file an eviction at this time. Courts are not accepting any I believe you can still file, but they're not going to set on the calendar for a hearing anytime soon. We're looking at another month before that happens. And so in the meantime, you cannot turn off utilities. You cannot change the locks. You can't do any of that. Everyone has to shelter in place where they are, and you're kind of have to deal with the muck as time passes by. But right now is not the time to try to do that. I only have time for one more. I didn't realize that we were going to get through our 30 minutes so quickly. Can I have a roommate held accountable for early termination fees of a lease? Okay, so I was living in an apartment with two roommates, and one of them has been laid off and they cannot pay rent, and so they are trying to leave within 7 days. And so now I will be responsible for the fees and any damages to the property as I'm listed as head of household. Okay, well, unfortunately, If you entered into a lease with somebody who has been laid off, or is hours have been cut, and so both of you guys are on the lease, the way that it works is that the landlord can come after either one of you for the full rent. So yes, you are responsible for any liquidated damages or continued rent if that tenant co-tenant does vacate the premises. So just so you know, you are on the hook because both of you guys signed the lease. And so that's the position that you're in. Thank you for joining. Jim Go To on Instagram. So I just wanted to let you guys know that, again, you guys can visit the website atlfamilyimmigrationlaw.com and go to the landlord tenant section where you guys can download a free ebook, and that will tell you a list of things to consider if you're a landlord or if you are a tenant in the midst of the pandemic. Just to reiterate, evictions are off as far as we know throughout the metro Atlanta area and possibly all of Georgia. Courts are closed to the public at this time. They are not scheduled to reopen until May 13th. That date could be pushed back again depending on how things continue to go. And so evictions right now cannot be filed, and even if they are filed, they will not be heard. And so that should give some folks a sigh of relief as they try to figure out how they're going to pay bills and continue to live in the midst of this pandemic. And it's important that you consider filing for unemployment if you haven't done so, to continue to get some funds in the door. Try to work out a payment plan with the landlord as much as possible. Hello, Mr. Crown Royal. Thanks for joining. We are actually wrapping up, but please visit the website, download the ebook, give us a call at 678-601-5580 if you wish to have a confidential consultation with the firm. All right. So thank you so much, guys. I will be back next week. I appreciate folks joining me on both Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it. Hello everyone on Facebook. Thank you so much for joining. Until next time.